You are listening to an American Free Press podcast. Joining me on the line is William A. White from prison, who's former commander of the American National Socialist Workers Party and a regular contributor to the Barnes Review and American Free Press newspaper. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on, Dave.
Bill, for the benefit of the listeners, first let them know where you're at right now.
Right now I'm in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago, though I'm actually about to leave here tomorrow for parts unknown. It appears they may have misfiled me. I've been prosecuted 7 times by the federal government in the last 5 years, and there's been a number of things going on. The case I'm up here on was a case that has been dismissed twice. It's now at the Supreme Court. It's kind of an interesting issue. I used to publish a website called overthrow.com, and we had about 150,000 unique readers every month, and we published some material that was critical of a juror in the Matthew Hale case, and the government charged me criminally with soliciting a violent felony for the fact that I criticized him in front of an audience that the government argued was inherently violent. And while the judge threw the case out twice, the Seventh Circuit, a Jewish fellow named Posner, writing the opinion for them, ruled that the government was correct and that people who share my point of view are so inherently criminal that to merely criticize somebody in front of such an audience is, in fact, a solicitation of a violent felony. And that's where I am right now. I was supposed to travel to Virginia for a 2255 appeal. This is another issue, very similar issue, but what happened there was, as it was on appeal at the Fourth Circuit, a Jewish fellow named Neuberger wrote an opinion upholding a similar case, but there were 2 dissents on the opinion, and the case was going to go en banc when suddenly my attorney, a woman named Melissa Scoggins, just simply didn't file the appeal. And she later admitted that she had been advised by somebody that it was no longer in her interest to represent me, and so she had deliberately sabotaged my appeal. So that gave rise to yet another appeal. And the issue there, the government has admitted that my attorney was tampered with, but has argued that I did not have a right to not have my attorney tampered with, if you can understand that. They're claiming that because appeals beyond the panel level do not carry a right to counsel, there is no right to what's called effective assistance to counsel, which means, as my friend Mike Piper said, that if I pay an attorney $50,000, the government can give her $100 and win the case without it ever being heard at a higher court.
Amazing.
Those are the formal legal issues. Now, those who've read American Free Press and have read about my case probably know what I was really arrested for was this. In these cases, there have been 7. There are 2 that are still alive. The others have been mostly dismissed. But there was an informant, sort of the James Bond of informants. His name was Harold Turner. And this guy was being sent all over the world. He was sent to Iraq, to Brazil. He was intercepting weapons for the Iraqi resistance and so forth. And he got out of control and he was fired by the FBI. Well, he decided to try to get a contract back by setting me up. And I have to say I was never charged with this, but he recruited 2 people that I marginally knew, I'd spoken to, and had them both tell the same lie to federal officials and persuaded the government to arrest me for crimes that I was never even charged with. And when the government realized I was innocent of those charges, they began throwing these speech cases on me to try to find some reason to justify having arrested me in the first place. So now, 5 years on, I've been released twice, I've been re-imprisoned twice, and I am sitting here, hopefully, waiting for some court somewhere to recognize I'm not guilty.
Now, you never really did anything except they're going after you because of your words?
Well, that's exactly right. Both the cases where they've achieved convictions have involved just simply criticizing people. The first case involved criticizing a federal juror. The second case involved criticizing people who had brought a essentially false federal lawsuit and had gone to the newspapers and the television. And basically what the court has found is that as long as the newspapers and the television are promoting the government's point of view, that's fine. They can comment however they like on these things. But when you start promoting a point of view different than that of the government, then you start having an issue.
You're in jail. Did you hit somebody? Did you kill somebody?
No, there's absolutely been no violence. But, the judge pointed out that if I'd actually attacked the juror in this case with a weapon, I would have received a lower sentence than if I had simply criticized him. And that was a factor that was just mentioned at the last hearing. And you know, Dave, what this really does is it shows the nature of the democratic system. What I was originally set up on was an alleged terror plot that fortunately I was never charged with. But during my time in federal prison, I have been subject to very extreme brutality, particularly at the beginning. I was subjected to sleep deprivation. I was thrown in cells that were freezing cold. I, at one point, was held overnight in a cell that was flooded with human feces, all in order to get me to confess to something that just never happened. And the first 30 months that I spent in prison, I can tell you I spent 21 of those in solitary confinement. And I have to say, thankfully, the reason I'm probably not there now is because of media like yours that has covered the case, and like the American Free Press. But this kind of brutality towards people, particularly in political cases, is extremely routine in the federal prisons. The Bond Reform Act that was passed by Reagan allows federal prosecutors to hold people who are accused of being so-called dangerous people without any conviction or criminal record. Until very recently, they've been allowed to hold those people indefinitely, often in subhuman conditions in solitary confinement. And this has been a routine procedure the Bureau of Prisons uses to extort false confessions from people. And really, these extorted false confessions are the bread and butter of the federal legal system. And it really has opened my eyes. I was always a critic of the U.S. government, but I was once somebody who fundamentally believed in the possibility of democratic change. And what I've really come to realize being in prison is that the U.S. government is fundamentally illegitimate. I mean, this is a group of extremely violent, essentially criminal people, not just in the United States towards their own citizens, but internationally. And they claim to be promoting democracy or the empowerment of people. But what they're really promoting is their own power over people in the name of democracy. Democracy for them has really become, the World Democratic Revolution, I should say, has really become for them what the World Workers' Revolution was for the Soviet Union. And they really don't scruple against using the same tactics here domestically that the Soviets used to control their own citizenry. And I have unfortunately sort of been trapped in the middle of this.
You mentioned before that a couple of these characters involved in your cases happen to be Jews. Is that a common theme that runs through your cases?
There's only really been one court I've been in front of where the lead judge, at least, now there were 3 judge panels in the circuit courts, has not been Jewish. And now it was also a Jewish fellow who dismissed the case twice. But at the appellate level, you have these sort of very radical Zionist, advocates of Talmudic law like Posner or Neuberger, who have been appointed, or neoconservatives, and they ally with the black sitting on the circuit court, and they rule that way. And that's sort of what American law has become, is these very ideological people sitting on the courts and making very ideological decisions. And, I've come to my own belief that democracy, as practiced by the United States and as imposed by force on the rest of the world, is a fundamentally illegitimate system. And I have to say, we haven't even got to plugging my books.
Right.
There is a fellow out there, Harold Covington, who's written a number of books, and I think has certainly outlined what is probably the only solution to the current situation.
Don't have much time. Why don't we talk about, you've written already 2 books.
I've got 2 books published and one I'm working on. My first book was called Centuries of Revolution, Democracy, Communism, Zionism. I'm going to be down to 1 minute, so I'll have to go quickly. My second book is Tradition of the Mother. Centuries of Revolution is a brief history of the Jews and shows how these political ideologies have emerged from paganism that was absorbed into Judaism. It's about to go into a second edition with Romanian, German, and Spanish editions planned. Tradition of the Mother is my latest book. It spans on the opening chapters of Centuries and gives background on how the original Jewish religion formed from the paganism of the Near East. I got 15 seconds. And my latest book, Serpent's Blood, carries that into the Middle Ages. And Dave, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go. Thank you very much for letting me on here.
Thank you, Bill. When will we be talking to you again?
As soon as I can get to a phone. It might be a few weeks.
I'll be here.
All right.
All right, Bill. Joining me on the line is William A. White from a federal prison in Oklahoma. Bill, thanks for joining us again today.
Well, thank you for having me back on, Dave.
Last time we spoke, you were in Chicago. Now, where are you?
I'm in the Oklahoma City Transfer Center, and I was fortunate enough not to be thrown in solitary confinement the moment that I arrived here. And by some other error, I've managed to get a bunch more time to use the phone. So I figured we could continue our interview and give also maybe a little bit of an update into what has happened since even Sunday. The Supreme Court has refused to hear my appeal.
It's the United States Supreme Court, right?
Yes, the United States Supreme Court refused to hear my appeal, which means that the government's decision that they can label the audiences of publications to be inherently violent, and thus to interpret any speech towards that audience as a solicitation of violence, stands. So this sort of unprecedented power that the United States has granted itself to attack the entire audience of a publication without identifying a single individual member of that publication to have ever been involved in any sort of violence, but to simply say because of a political view, an audience is inherently violent. That has now been affirmed for all purposes by the United States Supreme Court.
Okay, by them refusing to hear your case, you're saying?
That's correct. They've refused to hear it, which means that they uphold the decision of the Seventh Circuit.
Is that what that means, or does that mean they just don't want to get involved in it?
It means that they uphold it. They don't want to get involved in it, but that is the law now. I mean, the Seventh Circuit makes the law, and there's never been a case, a solicitation case, that has been decided in this manner in the past. So this new law that this Jewish federal judge Posner created with his opinion has now been essentially said that the Supreme Court has said that's okay.
So that's the law of the land now?
But it is in the Seventh Circuit.
And what exactly would someone have to do in order to violate this law?
Speak to an audience that the United States government feels is inherently violent. Criticize someone before an audience. What I did was criticize a federal juror on a website, and the judge determined that the audience of the website, all 150,000 monthly readers, unique readers, was inherently violent, and therefore my criticism could be interpreted as a solicitation of violence. So all you have to do is get in front of an audience that the government, for political reasons, has labeled inherently violent, and say that I dislike this person, and that could be interpreted as a solicitation for that audience to commit violent acts.
Okay, well, the United States is getting better and better. That's great.
There's no way for people who are outside the political system to participate in American democracy. The goal of participating in the American system is not a correct one. What has to happen is that the American system has to be removed if good people are going to govern this country again.
Yeah, if they ever did at all. I don't know. I'm beginning to have my doubts. What do you think?
I doubt that as well, and that's why I write my books. And we were going to, I think, talk a little bit more about my books. And, of course, I write basically on the philosophy of history or the interpretation of history. And I think it's actually amusing. I was just sent something published by Harold Carrington. He published a draft of a part of Chapter 2 from my new book, and then included a sort of a scathing criticism saying it was my efforts were ineffective because I had retreated into writing about history and religion. And I've tried to note to him that I am in prison and that these people do brutalize people who speak out on current political topics. And if I were to pursue, I think, the tactics he desires, I think that I would be cutting my own throat, kind of the way that things are now. For those who've seen what's happened recently with Matt Hale, where he's again been forbidden to even send mail to people outside of prison, I've been doing everything I can to do what I can while avoiding that kind of fate, because what would be the point if I can't speak to anyone at all? And further, I really don't think there's anything left to say about America. There's plenty to be done in this country, but again, the goal of trying to participate in the system through speaking about issues is really an unattainable goal. The government has absolutely forbidden anyone to speak out in a meaningful way or outside of the sort of false political dichotomy they've created. So I do what I can do, and one of the things I think is very important is the deconstruction of the progressive myth of history. The United States of America is dependent on this sort of false neo-Marxist narrative that it and its system is the culmination of all historical processes, and that this narrative is really the sole justification for American power. There is no pretense in this country that what the government does is based on right or wrong, or that it's engaged in service to some particular people, but merely that what it is doing is the inevitable result of history, and therefore everyone should simply get behind it because that's what's going to be. And to destroy this myth and to undermine the moral basis or the philosophical basis of American power involves a reevaluation of all values of history, and that is what I try to do in my books. Unfortunately, Dave, I'm being cut short here. I could try to call you later on today if you want to continue this. We could talk about some of the specific books in particular.
Yeah, that would be great. How much time do we have left?
We have 30 seconds, and it took a little while to set up, so I will try to call you in an hour. If not, I'll call you by no later than noon.
That would be great, Bill.